Hello and welcome to Why Comply Wednesday on Compliance Africa, our weekly feature dedicated to our readers, followers, and friends to gain your perspective on the case for compliance. Today we'll be taking a look at corporate social responsibility and its connection to compliance. And here with us to lend some important perspective on this topic is none other than my good friend and colleague, Mr. Joao Oliveira, who is an oil and gas lawyer out of Luanda, Angola. Hello, Joao.
Hi, good evening, everybody.
All right, so thanks for talking with us today. I hope you're doing well. Now, Joao, what really inspired this week's topic was actually the growing literature, especially on the internet, regarding the need for companies to essentially go beyond compliance, beyond the law, and to just think about ethics or the moral impact of their footprint in the places in which they operate, as well as in relation to the circumference, so to speak, of their stakeholders. I know that you've researched and written a good bit about, corporate social responsibility, and so I really want to garner your perspective on what you do think about companies making that intersection between CSR and compliance. And so I'm just going to jump right in and get as much light shed on this topic for us. Before we begin, if you just want to go ahead and describe a little bit of what it is that you do.
I'm currently an oil and gas lawyer. I work at a major oil and gas company here in Angola. And basically, at a professional level, that's it. Okay. I did some research on CSR when I was doing my thesis for my master in oil and gas in Houston. And my thesis was actually on corporate social responsibility and the impact that CSR has on countries where oil and gas companies operate.
Oh, okay, thanks for that. So in my view, I think that there's been a shift probably in the last decade or so for companies to go beyond legal and regulatory compliance. And I do talk about this on the blog. As I said earlier, going beyond compliance to take a more ethical or moral stance. What to you is the connection, if any, between corporate social responsibility and compliance?
Well, first of all, I agree with you. I think that in the last decades, there's been a mounting pressure on companies to go beyond merely complying with the regulations that host governments normally impose on them. That could be linked to the internet, to people having more information, and people being able to see online on the spot the same minute what companies are doing and giving their feedback. So there's been more pressure for it. Mm-hmm. And I think that it's a thin line between compliance and CSR because, well, in my opinion, I have a very strong opinion about this. And in my opinion, oil and gas companies especially, which is my area, although this could be applicable to other businesses. But in the oil and gas world, my experience tells me that I think companies should focus more on compliance and less on CSR. Mm. Why? Because oil and gas companies are good at what they do, which is drilling and getting oil. Mm-hmm. That's what they do. That's what they're prepared to do. Mm-hmm. They are not very good at managing CSR projects. Mm-hmm. On the other side, you do have a lot of companies and NGOs that are very good at what they do. Mm-hmm. So I do feel that in order to make a positive impact, companies should comply with what the host governments ask them to. Mm-hmm. They should strive for excellency in that, meaning they should try to minimize environmental impacts. They should try to pay as much as they can to their workers. Mm-hmm. But the problem is that governments, especially here in Africa, unfortunately, they look at companies and as they know that there's this pressure for them to go beyond compliance, mm-hmm. they tend to put on the company's shoulders the responsibility to do things that the government should do. Mm-hmm. I'll give you an example. There was in Liberia, mm-hmm. you had one case where the government told one oil and gas company, I can tell you which one, but if you Google it, it's easy to find which one is it. Mm-hmm. And they told them that they should talk to the local populations before drilling in this specific place. So the company went there and asked them what they wanted, and they said we need a hospital, and the company built an hospital. And nowadays the hospital is used to store cattle. Why? Because the government never assigned any doctors there, and the company cannot be running an hospital because they don't have doctors, they don't have the capability to do that. So basically, they spent a whole lot of money, and they didn't think that, well, if we're building the hospital, there should be some doctors here. And the government just felt, well, if they're doing it, why do I have to care about the population when let the oil and gas companies do it? And that's, from what I've researched, that's something that happens often, which is the governments tend to put the responsibility of developing the country in the companies. And that normally works very well. So, in my opinion, what oil and gas companies should be doing is complying with the regulations in terms of environment, trying to minimize the risks of their operations, because that's what they're good at, and then allocate sums of money to NGOs or companies that actually know what they're doing. And the issue is that oil and gas companies do have CSR departments, some of them, not all, but some of them have, but they're very weak departments because they're full of engineers and people who actually don't know what they're doing. They don't know how to evaluate the impacts of what they're doing, and that leads to a lot of money being spent in things that don't have the positive impact that they should have. And so that's my opinion.
No, I think it's great. I think you're offering quite a different perspective. I think it's a relevant perspective, and I think you raised some really great points. For instance, businesses want to be able to focus on their core operations, what they do best, right?
For instance, I don't know if you've ever looked at one of those. I always laugh when I see these oil and gas yearly reports on CSR, and you see, for instance, 10 million spent in education in Angola or Brazil or whatever, and then you're left with 10 million in education. What does that mean? They built schools, they spend 10 million in schools. Well, what does that mean? It doesn't say anything. It just says 10 million in education. And you don't know what they're doing. There's no accountability. And then the government comes and says, look, the company spent 10 million in education. They're actually developing the country. And then you go and you check it, and if you investigate it, sometimes they didn't spend 10 million in education. They gave 10 million to sometimes a shady organization or something,
right,
that sometimes is linked to someone from the government, and they say, well, we spent 10 million in education. The government told us to give 10 million to this company that supposedly is going to implement some projects, and we did, and that's it. So that's why what I defend is that companies should be held responsible for what they do, their corporations, in terms of environment, in terms of complying with labor laws. Then they should be held accountable for spending quite a bit of money in social projects, but they shouldn't be the ones managing it.
Right.
They should be able to choose whichever organization they wanted, give them the money, and let them do what they know best. I think companies should focus.
Okay. So, just to pick your brain a little bit more, of course, I think some of this shift toward companies going beyond just legal and regulatory compliance came about with situations and scandals such as the Shell scandal years ago in the 90s in the Niger Delta, where citizens were feeling like, okay, their industries, fishing industries, for instance, are collapsing. The company's not really investing in health or investing in boosting other industries. And so livelihood was at stake. And then you have pushback from the communities, and that results in community members attacking things like pipelines, kidnapping employees of the oil and gas company, and all of that. And so it's your solution for the companies not only to make sure that they are legally compliant, but to manage their impact. And then in terms of corporate social responsibility, outsource that to organizations that are focused on doing socially responsible work? Would that be your solution to a situation like that?
I think that we have to have a balance here, and the situation with Nigeria and with that specific oil and gas company, and the situation where one of the protesters was killed was a very famous case. The company was actually not complying with all the environmental standards it should. So it wasn't a situation where the company didn't invest in CSR and people got mad. The company was not complying with the rules that they should. That's what got people worked up and saying, look, you're polluting, you're not giving us jobs, anything. So I think it has to be a balance. For me, I think that companies should be held responsible for what they do, and they should be put under pressure to comply with labor law, environmental laws, you name it. As for CSR, I do have a strong feeling that companies should get a company that knows what they're doing and go for it, and just give the money to them, and then they should build a system where they can held accountable those corporations that they're giving money to, NGOs, you name it. Because in most cases, if you engage local NGOs that are actually on the spot, they know much more about what the population needs than the company, right?
Right.
However, what I'm saying is not risk-free, okay? For instance, there has been a lot of cases here in Africa, especially, where oil and gas companies have hired NGOs, that then they discovered that the NGO was getting money from local populations to decide where they would advise the company to invest in. Meaning they would go to villages and they would say, look, we have an oil and gas company that is willing to spend the next amount of money in schools or hospitals. If you pay us, we will tell the oil and gas company that they should put the school here. If you don't pay us, we'll go to another village and they will pay, and they will have the project and not you. So you have to be very, very careful on what so you have to really put in place a due diligence system so that you know that the NGO that you're giving money to is not getting kickbacks from the local populations, etc. So it's not easy. It's not an easy situation. I do think that companies investing too much in CSR in countries, especially in countries like the ones we have in Africa, where they are not completely developed or are in the stage of development, governments tend to relax and say, and tell the population, go ask the oil and gas companies. They're destroying, they're robbing our resources. That's always the rhetoric, right? They're robbing our resources. Go after them, go ask them. They should build schools, they should build roads, etc. And no, the government should be doing that.
Right.
The company should be doing what they do best, extract oil and gas, respect environmental standards. But what happens in reality is that governments tend to relax and say, look, there's oil and gas, they have money, let them do everything. And this leads to inefficiencies, because then the government is not prepared to do anything.
Right.
Because they always have someone that does that.
Right.
And then when you have a price crisis like the one you have now, where there's less money, governments are not prepared to face it because they haven't been doing anything for the last few years.
Right.
So I think that CSR is a good concept. I do think that people should engage in social responsibility, but I think that if you're a company, if you're giving dividends to your shareholders, let them invest in what they want. You understand what I'm saying?
Right.
As individuals, not as a company. As a company, just grab the money, give it to someone that knows what they're doing, put a due diligence system in place, make sure that they're doing the right thing, and I think the results are better. There's a number of situations where oil and gas companies engage in CSR projects that turned out to have zero effect.
Right. I think that's a very important perspective that you're bringing, that corporations should not take the place of government, right? So I think that's something I can absolutely, I can absolutely agree with you on that. And I think another good point you raised is that there needs to be a balance. So yes, there's legal and regulatory compliance, but where ethics plays a role is in how the company manages their impact and footprint. So, for example, we spoke about not complying with environmental laws or possibly best practices, right? So, making sure that you're not polluting and ruining livelihoods.
I'll give you a good example. For me, it's for instance, here in Angola, we have one thing, which is most, I don't know how it is in other countries in Africa and in the world, but I think that probably they have similar situations. But here in Angola, most oil companies, their workers are entitled to have a housing allowance.
Right.
Okay? But not a housing allowance in the sense that the company gives you money to pay your rent every month. The housing allowance, the way it works in Angola is the worker can ask for money from the bank, a loan, right? And the company pays for the interest for the entire loan and pays an X amount of the loan, say 20 or 30%.
Right.
What this means is that people, and the interest rates here in Angola are very, very high. So what this means is that the workers wouldn't be able to buy a house because they would have to pay 100% of the loan plus the interest rate, which is, again, really high here in Angola.
Right.
They're able to buy a house.
Right.
That, for me, is more positive than investing 3 million in building a school.
Right.
Then the government doesn't put professors there.
Right.
So the school is empty, you know?
Right.
Or the company having a policy of paying for the workers' kids to study at a good school. You know, those are all things that you have here
Right.
for local employees.
Right.
And that, for me, makes a more positive impact than simply building stuff, random stuff that then end up not being used by the populations.
Because the company's not there to do the maintenance, and that shouldn't be their job anyway.
Yeah, for me, companies should focus on family-oriented policies for their workers, trying to make the work environment as safer as possible for their workers, trying to make the company, trying to make the best for their workers, that the workers want to stay there, paying good wages, giving people freedom to work and to have a personal life. And for me, that's more important than engaging in CSR, which they're not prepared to do.
I really appreciate you bringing this perspective to the table that companies can actually be socially responsible without stepping outside of what their core operations are meant to be. And by improving, for instance, the economic position of your workforce. For instance, you gave the example of the companies assisting with the loan repayments. I think that is something that companies can think about. So I really appreciate that. The question that we ask all of our guests is, why comply? What is the case for compliance? As a lawyer, I'm sure you are familiar with the sentiment by most business-focused people that legal and compliance is somehow a fetter to progress. What is your response to that? What, in your words, would be, the case for compliance?
Oh, I think, as I said, for me, compliance is the most important thing. I think that nowadays, to a lesser extent, but unfortunately, in some countries, you still see that companies, energy companies, and not only energy companies, they do tend to circumvent regulations and to cut corners, and that's what leads to accidents and to more corruption. I mean, I think that compliance is essential to make companies safer and to develop the countries where they operate. Right. For instance, if you comply with the regulations where they say that you have to train a national workforce, if you actually comply, if you actually train the national workforce, even if you leave the country, because normally oil and gas projects run for 20, 25, 30 year stops. So when you leave the country 25 or 30 years later, you'll have a huge workforce which was really trained and is able to continue developing the country and working for other companies and doing a good job. And or environmentally, if you comply with all the environmental regulations, if you don't flare, if you don't if you don't have leaks, that brings positive change to the country.
Right.
So for me, compliance is what companies should focus on. Without compliance, things don't work.
I absolutely agree with you, and I really thank you so much for your time and your perspectives today. I think you've given a different angle from which to look at the CSR debate. And that has been beneficial, I think, for our readers and our followers. And of course, for more compliance perspectives from around Africa, you can always visit www.complianceafrica.wordpress.com. Until next week, it is take care and goodbye.